Hello again everyone, and a warm welcome to all our patrons who are getting this podcast early because you signed up at patreon.com/The History Network. If you're not a patron yet, Angus and I have produced a short video over at that link. I'll give it to you again. patreon.com/The History Network, where we explain what we'd like to achieve for the podcast from this season onwards. So do go and take a look if you've not done so already. I've also given a longer verbal introduction and explanation in episode 1 of this season if you want to hear more. Now, since last episode, Chris Guerin, Martin Collins, Andy Gurrell and Philip Scott have all signed up at Patreon, and a huge thank you to each of you. We really do appreciate it, and I hope I've pronounced all those names correctly. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 26, Episode 2, No Man's Land. This episode was written by Nicholas Gelber. Nicholas, who has written for us before, is a radiologist from Melbourne, Australia, with a long-standing interest in history. His main areas of interest are World Wars I and II and the American Civil War. He has been fortunate enough to have visited the Gettysburg battlefield 4 times. Thanks for the script, Nicholas. No Man's Land. 3 of the most evocative words of the Great War, never forgotten by combatants. A place of death, danger, wire, bullets, shells, poison gas, mud, rats, bodies and fear. A place which was never safe when going over the top, the place where you were most likely to die, but being wounded there could be worse. A quiet place occasionally, an inferno of fire and noise at other times. Occasionally a place of peace and friendship, such as Christmas 1914, but usually not. Although references to No Man's Land can be found as early as the Domesday Book, and in the Middle Ages the term was used for land outside the town walls, including places of execution, the general public will recognise it as a feature of warfare in general and trench warfare in World War I in particular, and this essay will be limited to that definition. No Man's Land was the area between the trench lines, which was not occupied by either side, and through which attacks by definition had to be made. After the initial war of movement in late 1914 into fixed trenches extending over 440 miles from the Belgian coast to Switzerland, the position of these trenches varied little for 4 years. The pattern was disrupted by major offensives, which had some success, such as the Allies' Somme offensive of July to October 1916, and on the other side the Kaiserschlacht or Spring Offensive of March 1919, during which forces of the defence were pushed back many miles. But this was a rarity over the 4 years, and so No Man's Land remained largely fixed. Even during these successful offensives, there was of course some ground, almost always between defenders and attackers, which strictly is no man's land, but the more fixed intervening ground is what most people would understand to be no man's land. The width of the land between the lines varied from several hundred metres to less than 10. Since in late 1914 much of the trench line was defined by limited strategic German withdrawals to higher ground, it is generally but not invariably true that the German observation of no man's land was superior to that of the Allies. Walking the ground today readily reveals what an advantage even very modest elevation was in this respect. Even with a few metres, ground can be observed better, and small ridges such as Ober's Ridge near Arras, the site of bloody and unsuccessful Allied attacks in May 1915, afford excellent views, particularly when the modern war tourist allows for the fact that trees were all cut down or shot to pieces at that time. Higher ridges such as Vimy provide spectacular visualization of the countryside for many miles, and it is easy to appreciate their strategic significance when standing there. The coal slag heaps of southern Belgium around Cambrin can be clearly seen at a distance of about 24 kilometres. Most of World War I no man's land is now returned to farmland, and on most of the Western Front original trench lines are, if traceable at all, only seen as vague lines of slightly altered soil content from the air. From the ground virtually nothing can be detected, although ploughed fields commonly have shrapnel and shell fragments on the surface. In places of extreme conflict, such as the Ypres salient, it took 10 years to reclaim this shell-torn landscape for farming purposes. No man's land continues, however, to give up its iron harvest, and it is not possible to drive around the Ypres salient or the Somme areas, for instance, without seeing shells recently dug up by farmers and construction crews and awaiting removal by army and other government organisations, which still today collect hundreds of tons of shells per year and detonate them under safe conditions. In the years shortly after the war, many farmers and other rural workers were killed by unexploded shells, but this is a rarity today. At Verdun, the scene of the largest and most prolonged battle of World War I, a huge area of 460 square miles of what is effectively no man's land, over which the battle was fought over 11 months, remains shell-pocked and uninhabitable, impregnated with millions of unexploded shells and innumerable body parts. Tourists are advised not to walk in the woods, now regrown, at the risk of being blown up. Similarly, at Vimy Ridge, adjacent to the huge white marble Canadian monument, there are extensive fenced-off areas with warning signs, mostly extending downhill in the direction from which the Canadians attacked over several weeks. There are a few places where enthusiasts can still see trench remains and no man's land, such as the Newfoundland Memorial on the Somme, where it is possible to look downhill slightly at the end over which the Canadians attacked across no man's land and appreciate the terrain. At Hill 60, near the Messines Ridge, in the Ypres salient, there is a wooden pedestrian walkway raised slightly over the still disturbed, acutely undulating ground on which the front-line positions are marked for the tourists by metal plates with written descriptions. These lines are less than 10 metres apart. During the war, the appearance of no man's land was extremely variable. We have been conditioned by accounts, for instance, of the appalling conditions at 3rd Ypres or Passchendaele to think of a cratered, mud-filled wasteland, devoid of growth, impregnated with body parts, strewn with war debris, often with heavier-than-air poison gas collecting in shell holes and ditches. And on active fronts during battles, this was commonly true. Wilfred Owen, arguably the most famous poet of the war, described it as like the face of the moon, chaotic, crater-ridden, uninhabitable, awful, the abode of madness. However, in quiet sectors, grass grew in the summer. There were intact trees and shrubs, partially intact walls and buildings, and there was little debris, and few, if any, bodies. Famously, poppies and other flowers grew, and there was even some wildlife, such as rabbits, in addition to the ever-present rats. Even in active areas, if there had been an agreement to bury bodies, they were not present. For instance, in Gallipoli, after the May 1915 Turkish attacks, the bodies were all buried under a truce, at least partly because of the appallingly hot weather and subsequent health risks, and with virtually uninhabitable conditions for both sides, resulting from the large numbers of Turkish dead. A constant feature of no man's land, except during periods of acute battle movement, was barbed wire. Both sides had wire just in front of their lines to hold up attacks, deter trench raids, and so on. The wire varied, but good wire was several layers deep, up to 10 metres, with carefully planned oblique corridors through which attacks and patrols could be made, corridors which were undetectable from the enemy observation points. Wire was almost always strung on metal pickets, which were coiled like corkscrews to hold the ground and hold the wire. These pickets remain a common sight in regrowth woods, for example, but have been removed by farmers from arable land after the war. An indication of picket and wire strength is the innumerable accounts of dead men hung up on the wire, that is, killed while entangled and held partly upright by the wire defences. Such bodies could last for weeks and months, slowly deteriorating in sight of the lines. As an aside, German wire was stronger than Allied wire, and for some months early in the war British handheld wire cutters could not cut it, necessitating officers to buy their own stronger versions while on leave at home. Control of no man's land is a concept dependent on the local regiments and their attitude to the area. As has been discussed with respect to wire, both sides had wiring parties in no man's land, but some regiments took pride in controlling the area, that is, exerting more influence over it than the enemy. Robert Graves, in Goodbye to All That, arguably the most famous World War I autobiographical account on the side of the Allies, states clearly that his regiment, the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, demanded this and patrolled vigorously to achieve it. On the other hand, it is clear from other accounts that in quiet sectors there was much less patrolling, and indeed there was almost certainly a series of understandings between opposing units to live and let live at times, which was accompanied by very much less vigorous control of the area. A famous World War I air ace, Billy Bishop, was at one stage shot down in the Somme sector, hiding in no man's land in a shell hole during the day and assisting in retrieval of his damaged aircraft the next day or night. So what do we make of this story? He was clearly concerned about snipers during the day, but why wasn't some shelling called down on the aircraft to prevent its future use? The answer is unclear, but it suggests that not every piece of no man's land was under intense observation and subject to shelling as needed. Patrolling of no man's land was of course a nocturnal event. Patrols had several purposes. Firstly, as already discussed, there was the issue of imposing so-called control. Secondly, intelligence was always required and could be obtained in several ways. Listening to chatter in the enemy front lines could be helpful, but taking prisoners was considered particularly useful. These could be taken most commonly from enemy sapheads and also sentries from front lines. But another source was enemy patrols, which were not uncommonly encountered in no man's land. There are many accounts of such encounters, many resulting in the two groups avoiding each other, either because they suspected the other group to be significantly stronger, or unofficially on the live and let live principle. Many of the latter would not be reported on return, lest a more senior officer than the patrolling one, who invariably would consider this an act demonstrating insufficient fighting spirit. One indication that the enemy had a concurrent patrol out was the lack of normal sporadic rifle and other fire from their front line. This is a situation where it was too quiet. Interestingly, this was the period before the Geneva Conventions, and contrary to modern standards of name, rank and serial number, there are numerous accounts of prisoners readily giving quite valuable military information over on capture, particularly later in the war when morale was lower, such as in 1918 on the German side after the failed spring offensive. Even if they didn't say much, the unit badges of prisoners would allow an analysis of the troops opposite and perhaps indicate some intentions. Knowing the unit opposite had changed to a guards regiment, for example, increased the likelihood of an attack. Another regular activity in no man's land at night was wiring parties. Wire rusted, fell off supports, and when shelled, particularly with high explosives, once both sides worked out that shrapnel had little effect on wire, needed to be repaired. This could only be done at night and was highly hazardous. One of Graves's closest friends, David Cuthbert Thomas, was fatally wounded in 1916 while leading a wiring party. Patrolling parties were small and very intent on keeping quiet. Less noise bring down flares, particularly the very effective German parachute flares, the light from which could then direct rifle or machine gun fire on the patrol. Officers commonly wore cutaway socks on the knees to protect them, and there are many reports of extremely careful crawling with intermittent, prolonged stops in no man's land to observe and listen, taking perhaps 2 hours to cover just 200 yards. Patrols carried improvised and non-conventional weapons in anticipation of hand-to-hand fighting in which silence was still a priority. These included clubs, koshes, and various types of trench daggers, including some which resembled brass knuckles but with spikes. Patrolling was also considered a way of demonstrating appropriate personal courage, often to satisfy senior officers. Graves says that it was customary and expected for all new subalterns to patrol on their first night in the trenches with the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. If parties were detected, it was considered safest to remain standing, if standing at the time. This was because movement was easier to detect. The man was hoping to be taken for a tree stump, and the flares at night tended to have more of a silhouetting effect rather than true illumination. Further, standing tended to put the critical head and chest above the level of rifle and machine gun fire, made leg wounds much more likely, perhaps even a blighty, a wound which would take them out of the war without destroying their post-war life. Having said that, a quick dive into long grass or a shell hole was also a good tactic. Patrols detected in this way could be pinned down and have to spend the entire next day in no man's land in shell holes if there was insufficient darkness remaining to regain the lines. After attacks, no man's land contained wounded men, often sheltering in shell holes. They were, if possible, rescued at night, although many were found to have died of wounds in that time. Again, reading between the lines, since there are few official reports of anything other than offensive behaviour, some latitude was given under circumstances such as these. After all, soldiers of both sides had a profound understanding of the problems of wounded men between the lines, and nearly everyone was openly or secretly hoping for a blighty. For all the activity in no man's land during the day and night which we have discussed, there is also activity below no man's land to be considered. Saps or tunnels were basically constructed under no man's land for at least 5 reasons. Saps with an open sap head could result in a fairly safe place from which to listen and observe in no man's land. Access could be underground and much safer than crawling out to an observation post at night. Use was made of existing shell holes so that a trench or tunnel could be dug out into no man's land to meet a shell crater, which then acted as a sap head. In fact, there was a standing order in the British Army from 1916 that all craters within 60 yards of the front line should be occupied for the purposes already discussed. Sap heads could be connected in a line parallel to the front line, thereby creating a new front line closer to the enemy. This was a particularly common tactic when the width of no man's land was significant and an attack was planned, since the attackers would spend less time in no man's land under fire while attacking. Unfortunately, the creation of new front lines was impossible to do in secret and suggested to the enemy that an attack was imminent, which partially took away the advantage of a more narrow no man's land. In order to preserve secrecy and give the attackers an even more proximate jump-off point, the saps could also be extended very close to the enemy lines and kept underground until the last minute, but this necessarily limited the number of men who could firstly crawl through the tunnel and then exit close to the enemy front line. This was not a tactic used in major attacks for this reason. Further, saps were dug under enemy lines in order to mine them and blow them up shortly before attacks. Most famously, this occurred on the Messines Ridge in 1917, when the Allies used 23 huge mines, 21 of which detonated, and the noise of which could be heard in London. The craters of these mines remain visible today as small lakes, easily seen at Spanbroek, somewhat ironically now called the Pond of Peace, and they can also be seen at St. Eloi, for instance. The Spanbroek crater has a raised rim of perhaps 2 times 5 meters, but the explanatory signs and plaques decline to mention that there must be thousands of German bodies in it and similar crater rims in the area. The St. Eloi craters are on private land but can be accessed by the public as long as you can speak enough French to call and ask for the gate code. Such mines caused huge damage and opened significant gaps in the enemy front line, but since the German defence was almost always one of defence in depth, the second and third lines of defence remained intact. Further, the crater itself was difficult for the attackers to negotiate, and they essentially tried to go around the crater rather than through it because of the loose soil and other impediments to movement. Lastly, tunnels were cut for the purposes of counter-mining, since the enemy was known to be mining too. Initially, tunnels were used as underground listening posts, since mining was very difficult to do in silence. The tunnel could then be directed towards an enemy tunnel once detected. The general idea was to place a mine close to the enemy's tunnel and detonate it to destroy their works. This resulted in a game of cat and mouse, immensely stressful for the sapper companies, with a race to detect enemy tunnels and destroy them first. These were men usually drawn from mining towns in order to take advantage of their underground skills, and so were used to the idea of sudden death underground due to mining accidents, but this risk was another order of magnitude. How dangerous was no man's land during the day? With a few special exceptions, the answer is that no man's land during the day was lethal. As a generalization, shell fire accounted for most casualties on the Western Front, followed by machine guns, but a significant number of men lost during quiet periods were killed by snipers. There are innumerable accounts of head injuries where men got careless about keeping low at places where the parapet was low, which was more common in Flanders, where the nature of the terrain prevented deep entrenchments, than further south in the line. Rare exceptions to this include truces such as the famous Christmas truce of 1914 and occasional individual events often related to the wounded. Graves tells a story of a man who bandaged and gave water to a wounded man in no man's land under a white flag during daylight, returning at night to evacuate him. The Germans did not fire, and what is even more extraordinary is that the man was decorated for bravery, indicating that such actions were not condemned by higher ranks. A strange indication of the powerful psychological effect of no man's land on combatants is the persistent legend of the so-called inhabitants of no man's land, who were allegedly bands of deserters. Such stories were quite common post-war, told on both sides, and authors included highly respectable writers such as Sir Osbert Sitwell. The general theme was that of wild bands of deserters living underground in deserted dugouts, scrounging food, clothing and boots from the dead in no man's land, and living an anarchic existence driven by their own personal needs and banding together in small groups only when it was to their advantage, of course avoiding their own armies and their disciplinary arrangements. Most of these accounts were written as novels, but there were interesting undertones. Some accounts have the wild bands looking after wounded who came into their care, a more sane alternative to the truth of what was happening above in the real no man's land. No man's land was a feature of trench warfare and essentially disappeared after World War I, when conflicts became almost always wars of some movement, particularly under the influence of armour. There would always be ground between the front lines, but never again would the static lines, overwhelming advantages of defence over offence, incessant shelling over weeks, months and years rather than days, use of poison gas and unsupported infantry attacks against machine guns, result in what we now call World War I no man's land. Thanks again, Nicholas, for sending us that script. It was a pleasure to read. If you're not a patron yet, then please do pop along to patreon.com/The History Network and find out all about it there. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Nicholas Gelber, read by Nick Barker.